August 6, 1945, started like any other day in the underground war rooms of Tokyo. Yet it would end as the day Japan's highest military commanders finally faced a reality they had spent 4 years refusing to see. Messages had been coming in for months, but nothing prepared them for the transmission that arrived that morning, decoded and clear. It revealed not just a new weapon, but an entirely new scale of American capability. For decades, Japan had believed it could match or outlast its opponent, relying on bravery, training, and tradition. Yet the numbers they now saw were staggering. The Americans had been building an industrial war machine beyond anything Japan had imagined, and until now it had been held back, restrained almost, as if for this very moment. The shock in the war room was immediate. Admirals and generals stared at each other, unblinking, as the words on the page confirmed the impossible. Reports from reconnaissance pilots over Hiroshima showed a city prepared for annihilation. Factories, railways, and military installations were already targeted with deadly precision. The weapon itself, the atomic bomb, was unlike anything in the history of warfare. The scale of destruction it could unleash made conventional battles almost irrelevant. Even those who had been skeptical of America's capacity to project power now understood the depth of the deception, the quiet withholding of force that had masked their true potential. While Japan's leaders had been planning defenses and calculating strategy, America had been operating at a fraction of its full capacity, stockpiling, innovating, and preparing for the decisive moment. The transmission also hinted at what had been unspoken in intelligence briefings for years. The Manhattan Project alone had cost more than Japan's entire war budget for 1944. The scale of investment, the coordination of scientists, engineers, and military planners revealed a nation operating on a level Japan had never imagined. As the war room struggled to process this information, whispers of disbelief grew into tense discussions. How could they have been so wrong? How had they failed to see the industrial might, the technological brilliance, and the sheer scale of American preparation? Every assumption that had guided Japanese strategy, the idea that morale and courage could overcome steel, that sacrifice could offset resources, now appeared fragile, almost naive. Even the most senior commanders, men who had faced front lines and directed battles for years, found themselves confronting a truth that went beyond defeat. It was a realization that Japan had been living under a comfortable illusion, and now that illusion was shattered. Decisions that had seemed rational, even brilliant, now appeared desperate. The room fell silent as they imagined the implications, the cities, the civilians, the impossibility of mounting any effective counterattack. They were no longer dealing with conventional warfare. They were facing a reality in which American capacity was limited only by political will, and the war they had known was already over before it had fully begun. In hushed tones, officers began calculating how long it might take for further strikes, their minds racing through maps, troop deployments, and potential responses. But the magnitude of the threat rendered every calculation almost meaningless. This was not a moment of hope or even planning, it was the moment of stark recognition. For the first time, Japan's military leadership understood the scale of the force they had underestimated, the force they had thought they could outlast, the force that now demanded surrender or annihilation. The weight of that realization would echo through every decision, every conversation, and every unspoken thought in the days to come, as the empire confronted a power it had never fully imagined and could no longer deny.
The morning after the transmission, the commanders gathered again in the dimly lit war rooms beneath Tokyo, still trying to make sense of what they had learned. Shock had given way to a cold, gnawing fear as reality settled over every officer present. For years, reports from the front lines, intercepted messages, and reconnaissance flights had hinted at American strength, but none had conveyed the true scale. Intelligence warnings that should have been acted upon were ignored or dismissed as exaggeration. Japan's leaders had built a strategy on assumptions, believing that courage, training, and unyielding spirit could offset industrial power. Yet now those assumptions were unraveling. Pilots returned with photographs of Hiroshima, not just ruins, but a city flattened in an instant, revealing the unimaginable destructive power of a single bomb. Factories, bridges, and neighborhoods had vanished, and the commanders understood that no conventional defense could survive such force. Discussions turned to calculations of what America could do next, and every estimate seemed smaller than reality. Reports from engineers, statisticians, and intelligence officers laid out the numbers behind the destruction. Aircraft production, shipbuilding, and munitions output far exceeded anything Japan had thought possible. Even those who had advocated continued resistance began to whisper doubts. How could a nation so far away wield such influence over the fate of the empire? Beyond the numbers, the psychological toll was undeniable. Senior officers who had spent decades at the front, men accustomed to making life-and-death decisions, now felt powerless. Strategies and plans that had guided battles and campaigns were suddenly irrelevant. The illusion that Japan could control its destiny was gone, replaced by an acute awareness of vulnerability. Conversations became confessions. Some admitted that they had long known the truth but had avoided acknowledging it, clinging to the hope that morale could overcome material disadvantage. Others argued that surrender was unthinkable, yet even their voices carried a note of desperation. Soviet movements in the north compounded the anxiety. Intelligence reports confirmed that the Red Army was preparing to enter the war, a development that Japan had hoped to avoid at all costs. The combination of American industrial might, the atomic bomb, and Soviet mobilization created a strategic trap from which there appeared to be no escape. As the day progressed, commanders pored over maps and charts, recalculating troop positions, supply lines, and potential counterattacks. But the more they examined the data, the more impossible the situation became. Every city, every port, every industrial center was within reach of overwhelming force. Even if Japan could mount a counterattack, it would be insignificant against the scale of destruction that could be delivered at any moment. The commanders also began considering the terrifying possibility that other cities could be targeted with even more powerful weapons in the coming days, and that the empire's resources were insufficient to respond. By nightfall, a grim silence had settled over the war rooms. Men who had once commanded armies and fleets now sat quietly, unable to speak, their thoughts heavy with the knowledge that the empire they had dedicated their lives to defending was facing an enemy whose strength they had underestimated for too long. The realization was brutal. Japan had not only misjudged America's capacity for war, it had misjudged the nature of modern warfare itself. Spirit alone, however fierce, could not match industry, innovation, and logistical precision. In that silence, the commanders confronted a truth that would haunt every decision in the days ahead. The war was no longer winnable by the methods and assumptions that had guided them for 4 years. Denial had ended, and the full weight of reality pressed down, demanding acknowledgement, strategy, and perhaps, for the first time, consideration of surrender.
By the third day, the reality of American industrial might had begun to settle in the minds of Japan's highest commanders, and disbelief had given way to grim calculation. The reports on their desks were staggering. Admiral Toyota, once confident in Japan's ability to outmaneuver its enemy, now admitted that American carrier and aircraft production had reached levels the Japanese had considered impossible. Every month, thousands of planes rolled off assembly lines, more than Japan could ever hope to destroy. Shipyards produced aircraft carriers, battleships, and submarines in numbers that made entire Japanese fleets seem like fragile toys by comparison. Even munitions production was astronomical, with artillery shells, bombs, and rifles being manufactured at a pace that Japan's factories could not match. The scale was not just numerical, it was technological.
The Manhattan Project alone had cost more than Japan's entire war budget for 1944, and the atomic bomb represented a level of scientific innovation that had no precedent. Commanders pored over diagrams, schematics, and reconnaissance photographs, trying to comprehend the combination of scale and precision. They realized that every defensive plan they had drawn up was obsolete. Every strategy that relied on attrition rendered meaningless. America's ability to produce more, faster, and with higher efficiency than Japan could destroy meant that any prolongation of the war only increased their disadvantage. Even if Japanese forces fought with the utmost courage, every aircraft, every ship, every factory that survived a strike would quickly be replaced, and the balance of power would continue to tilt inexorably. The commanders also considered the hidden cost of restraint. Until now, America had been holding back, revealing only a fraction of its potential power. The full scale of industrial and technological capacity was far greater than Japan had imagined. As they studied production figures, it became clear that what had seemed like impressive American losses in previous battles was nothing more than a fraction of what could be replaced in weeks. The implications were devastating. Cities could be destroyed one after another, infrastructure obliterated, and the Japanese war machine ground to dust before it had a chance to retaliate. Even beyond the atomic bomb, conventional weapons were being produced in such quantities that Japan's capacity to respond was insignificant. Every calculation, every countermeasure, every plan to turn the tide now seemed like an exercise in futility. The psychological impact on the commanders was profound. Men who had prided themselves on precision, strategy, and foresight were forced to confront a force they could neither outsmart nor outproduce. The meticulous reports on aircraft sortie rates, ship construction, and munitions output were not mere numbers. They were proof of a scale of warfare that Japan had never before encountered. By the end of the day, the war rooms were quiet. The only sounds the scratching of pens and the soft murmur of officers reading over grim data. The empire they had defended for decades was confronting an opponent whose capacity to project power, replenish losses, and innovate technologically was virtually limitless. Every officer understood that spirit and tradition, however noble, could not withstand such overwhelming industrial might. The realization was inescapable. Japan had not misjudged an army or a fleet, it had misjudged the very nature of war in the modern age. Every moment of delay, every refusal to acknowledge intelligence warnings had compounded the disadvantage, leaving the empire facing a seemingly insurmountable adversary, armed with both ingenuity and production capacity. Many commanders, for the first time, began whispering that no amount of sacrifice or valor could bridge the widening gap, and that the empire's survival was hanging by a thread. The stark truth pressed on every mind in that room. The enemy they had underestimated was already ahead, and there was no time left to catch up.
By the fourth day, the psychological weight of reality had fully settled on Japan's military leadership, and the war rooms were filled with an almost tangible tension. General Anami, the Minister of War, had summoned the Supreme War Council to review intelligence and assess the empire's remaining options. What had begun as a series of grim calculations now became deeply personal. Officers who had once spoken with confidence now whispered, their voices strained with disbelief and fear. Admiral Toyota confessed in precise terms what they had long suspected but never fully acknowledged. America's industrial and technological power far exceeded Japan's capacity to respond. Ships, planes, munitions, and weapons of unprecedented destructive capability could be replaced faster than they could be destroyed, rendering every strategy of attrition useless. Anami's own testimony was raw and emotional. Before the emperor, he admitted that Japan had been living under a dangerous illusion, that courage and sacrifice alone could not overcome the staggering disparity in resources.
He spoke of lost opportunities, ignored intelligence, and the illusion that morale could substitute for material superiority. Many officers in the room had tears in their eyes, some silent, others muttering apologies for failures, both real and perceived. Each confession revealed not just defeat, but decades of misjudgment and strategic self-deception. The intelligence officers presented reports detailing American production figures, the scale of the Manhattan Project, and the rapid replenishment of forces even after losses in previous battles. The data was undeniable, and it forced every member of the council to confront the unthinkable. The war could not be won by conventional means, and continuing would result in total destruction. Discussions turned to the Soviet threat. Intelligence confirmed that the Red Army would soon enter the Pacific conflict, further reducing any chance of a successful defense. The combination of American power, atomic capability, and Soviet involvement left Japan with few options. The commanders debated surrender, but pride and tradition clashed with pragmatism. Anami, though emotionally broken, tried to weigh honor against survival, knowing that the decisions made in these rooms would determine the fate of millions of civilians and soldiers. Some officers proposed desperate countermeasures, others argued that resistance was futile, yet every suggestion was shadowed by the stark reality laid out in intelligence reports and reconnaissance data. By late evening, the council's meetings had become a mix of strategic calculation and personal reckoning. Men who had once commanded fleets and armies now confronted a truth far larger than any battlefield victory or defeat. Japan's empire was facing a power it could neither match nor outlast. Even those who had previously believed in the invincibility of spirit understood that the very foundations of warfare had changed. As Anami prepared for what would become his final decision, the officers recorded their observations, testimonies, and confessions, creating a paper trail that would later serve historians in understanding the depth of denial, the sudden confrontation with reality, and the human cost of strategic misjudgment. The psychological collapse of the commanders was complete. Pride, ambition, and long-held assumptions crumbled under the weight of undeniable facts. The war rooms were no longer just spaces for military planning. They had become chambers of personal reckoning, where leaders faced not only defeat, but the realization that their assumptions had brought the empire to the brink of annihilation. Every mind in that room understood that time had run out, that the choices made in the next hours would determine the survival or total destruction of the nation. Some officers who had dedicated their entire lives to service and honor now privately questioned whether any action, no matter how courageous, could avert total catastrophe. The burden of these decisions, heavy and immediate, would mark the final days of the empire's strategic leadership forever.
By the fifth day, the weight of realization had transformed from shock into sober reflection across Japan's command structure. The intelligence reports were irrefutable. Every calculation, every assessment, and every estimate confirmed the unavoidable truth. Japan had misjudged the scope of American industrial and technological power, and the war could no longer be won. Commanders who had once relied on morale, courage, and tradition now understood that these qualities, however admirable, could not overcome the combination of sheer numbers, precision, and innovation. Discussions in the war rooms turned to the broader implications of surrender. The atomic bomb had demonstrated that America could destroy entire cities in an instant, but the full scale of production capacity revealed a grim truth. If resistance continued, even more devastation was inevitable. Intelligence officers presented data on American shipbuilding, aircraft assembly, and munitions production, all far exceeding Japanese capacity to counter or destroy. Every day of delay now meant further exposure to overwhelming force.
Officers began reviewing scenarios for civilian evacuation, anticipating the further destruction of urban centers, ports, and supply networks. Even Japan's most staunch traditionalists, who had clung to the belief that honor demanded continued resistance, could not escape the evidence. The psychological toll was pervasive. Leaders faced not only the external threat of annihilation, but the internal reckoning of strategic misjudgment. They understood that for years the empire had operated under illusions, ignoring intelligence warnings, dismissing reconnaissance data, and overestimating its own resilience. The final reports of reconnaissance pilots, the declassified Manhattan Project assessments, and the detailed production figures collectively painted a picture of an adversary capable of replacing losses faster than Japan could inflict them. The lesson was clear. Spirit alone could not compensate for industrial might, and pride could no longer justify further bloodshed. In these final hours of deliberation, commanders recorded their conclusions with meticulous detail, aware that history would judge not only the outcome of the war, but the decisions that led to it. They documented the psychological collapse of leadership, the painful acknowledgments of failure, and the sobering recognition that Japan had miscalculated from the start. Discussions turned to the sequence of surrender, the preservation of what remained of the population, and the hope that acknowledging reality could avert total annihilation. Every mind in the war rooms was occupied with the stark truth. The empire faced a power it could neither outproduce, outmaneuver, nor outfight. The decisions that would follow were not simply strategic, they were moral, existential, and irreversible. As the final hours approached, commanders confronted the enormity of their errors and the suffering their misjudgments had caused. The war rooms, once centers of planning and confidence, had become spaces of reflection, confession, and acceptance. Japan's leaders understood that the empire they had built, fought for, and defended was no longer capable of shaping its own destiny in the face of overwhelming power. The lessons were harsh and undeniable. Never underestimate the industrial and technological potential of an adversary. Always confront intelligence honestly, and recognize that illusions, however comforting, can have devastating consequences. In those final hours, as the weight of reality pressed upon them, the empire reached the edge of its strategic and moral limits. Denial was over, illusions shattered, and history would remember the consequences of underestimating an enemy whose strength had been quietly unmatched all along. Commanders recorded final assessments and messages, knowing that future generations would read not only the numbers and strategies, but also the human cost of years spent believing in comforting lies rather than hard truths. The full scale of American capability had been revealed too late, and with that revelation came the ultimate reckoning, the recognition that the empire's fate had been determined by the stark truths its leaders had spent years denying.